Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar hosted by the Fairness Foundation, and thank you all for coming today. So my name is Will Snell. I'm the Chief Executive of the Fairness Foundation. Pleased to be launching our new report published today, Mission to the Future, and I'm delighted to be joined by Derek Walker, the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, and Kat Tully, Managing Director of the School of International Futures. Unfortunately, my colleague Anita Sanger, the author of the report, is unable to join us today because she's had to have emergency dental treatment, so I will be covering her section of the report. And the report, Mission to the Future, looks at why we need long-termism in UK politics and how to achieve it, drawing on international case studies, including Wales, of course, and setting out some specific recommendations for the UK, which we will discuss in a bit. And I'm going to briefly introduce the report, and then I'll invite our panel to share their thoughts on some of the issues raised, and then we'll turn over to audience Q&A, and there should be plenty of time for questions before we finish at 2 p.m. So please submit your questions using the Q&A function on Zoom, which should be at the bottom of your screen. The earlier the better, and you can also upvote other people's questions. Before I start, I'm just going to share some links in the chat box to the report, but also to just some relevant reports, both from the School of International Futures and from the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. I'm going to do, as soon as Zoom lets me copy and paste something into the box, which it's not doing. So I'm going to talk about the report first, and then I will figure out that technical gremlin out and sort it out while Kat and Derek are speaking. So without further ado, the report. But first off, the Fairness Foundation. So we work to change the debate about fairness to build a fairer Britain. And we work to make three linked arguments to politicians in the UK and other decision makers. First, the moral case for fairness and building and popularising a vision for a fairer Britain that can attract broad support. Secondly, demonstrating that the public are more concerned about unfairness and supportive of action by governments to build a fairer society than we often think they are, the political case, if you like. And thirdly, showing that tackling inequality should be a national priority by promoting evidence of the ways in which unfairness and inequality not only reinforce each other, but also undermine economic growth, social cohesion, democracy, and action on net zero, so the policy case. And this report, Mission to the Future, looks at how UK politics is focused on short-term crises at the expense of thinking and acting on long-term problems, which is a barrier to building a fairer society, but is also undermining opportunity and growth and damaging our democracy and society more broadly. And the report, which I'm going to outline now, covers the costs of short-termism in politics, as well as the benefits of long-termism, barriers to thinking and acting in the long term, and how we get around those barriers. And it draws on best practice examples from Wales and elsewhere. Now, a decade ago, the Welsh government did something really quite revolutionary by signing into law the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. It required the Welsh government and all public bodies in Wales to improve long-term social, economic, cultural, and environmental well-being, and established a Future Generations Commissioner to hold those bodies accountable. And in the decade since then, Wales has seen some concrete policy results, including reductions in household emissions and increased participation in volunteering and sports, alongside a more engaged public dialogue about the future. And the culture of policymaking in Wales has undoubtedly changed for the better. Other countries have also taken action to think and act more in the long term. For example, Singapore's Centre for Strategic Futures and New Zealand's requirement for long-term insight briefings both show that embedding foresight and intergenerational fairness into government is both possible and beneficial. However, in the UK as a whole, we're somewhat behind the curve. The Labour government's focus on 5 national missions is a step in the right direction, and there are signs that ministers are trying to grapple with issues that will affect us for decades to come, not least on net zero. But politics in the UK is still largely focused on the 5-year time horizon of the electoral cycle. And worse still, the government seems trapped in something of a doom loop of reacting to the latest crisis emerging from the US or elsewhere, and has neither the political courage or bandwidth to be more proactive or strategic. Now, why does this matter? Surely it's both necessary and right to be agile, opportunistic, and to be reacting to a fast-moving and unpredictable news agenda, whether globally or domestically. Well, the problem with that approach is that it doesn't incentivize our political leaders to take the difficult decisions now that are needed to avoid huge costs and risks in the future and to build a better future for everyone. And one example of this short-termism was when successive UK governments used the private finance initiative to save money by shifting the bill for public infrastructure projects off the balance sheet to be repaid many times over by future governments and generations. And in particular, short-termism is a barrier to tackling inequalities and building a fairer society, but it's also bad news for the government's broader set of policy priorities. And we believe that the government in the UK is overestimating the costs of focusing on the long term and underestimating the costs of continuing to prioritize short-term issues. Short-termism makes it harder for the government to achieve its opportunity mission, which relies on tackling the out-of-school barriers to opportunity, such as poverty and poor housing, that we covered in a report called Deepening the Opportunity Mission last July. And this then leads to wasted talent and potential, damaging our economy and undermining the government's growth mission. A narrow focus on immediate priorities prevents politicians from making the difficult decisions needed to improve living standards. And this not only costs the government votes, as we saw last week in the Runcorn and Helsby by-election, but also weakens public faith in politics and thereby damages our democracy. And of course, short-termism undermines progress on the net zero mission and on our broader ability to tackle the climate crisis. The tragedy is that the benefits of long-termism are not hypothetical, and where governments have invested for the future, the returns have been transformative. In the UK, the early 2000s saw real progress in expanding opportunity, only for it to be undone by austerity. For example, the Sure Start programme delivered measurable improvements in educational outcomes, especially for disadvantaged children, and could have saved the government millions in youth justice and social care costs if it had been retained. Delays in investing in renewable energy and critical infrastructure have left the UK lagging behind its international peers, with higher energy bills and missed opportunities for green growth. And cuts to public health and social care, combined with a failure to prepare for pandemics, have left the NHS overwhelmed and widened health inequalities. And the COVID pandemic exposed the folly of prioritising short-term cost-cutting over long-term resilience. So in these ways, short-term thinking in politics creates a negative feedback loop. It raises levels of inequality, which increases our shared vulnerability to shocks, which exacerbates the severity of immediate crises, which in turn increases the pressure for quick fixes. And this undermines the prospects for thinking and acting in the long term. So what can we do to get out of this vicious cycle? In the report, we identified 3 barriers to effective long-term thinking in government. First, that the centre of government lacks the leadership, skills, capacity and incentives for long-term policymaking, and that the dominance in particular of treasury brain thinking, which prioritises immediate cost savings over future benefits, makes it hard to invest in long-term projects. Second, that the public is not well engaged in long-term policy design. And third, that psychological barriers make it difficult for all of us, politicians or the broader public, to attach enough importance to the interests of future generations. To overcome these barriers, in the report, we identified 2 immediate practical solutions that we think would start to turn the tide. First, we recommend the appointment of a UK-wide Future Generations Commissioner who's empowered to advise government, assess the long-term impacts of policies, and champion intergenerational fairness. Second, we suggest that the government launches a national dialogue on the future, engaging citizens and shaping the society they want to leave behind. And these steps, modelled on successful international examples, would improve policy outcomes while helping to rebuild public trust in politics and to foster a sense of shared purpose. The challenges facing the UK, from climate change to technological disruption and rising inequality, demand nothing less than a fundamental shift in how we govern. Short-termism is not just a political weakness, it is a threat to our collective future. And by embedding long-term thinking and intergenerational fairness into the fabric of our political system, we can create a society that is fairer, healthier, and more resilient. So I'm going to hand over now to our panelists, to Derek and Kat, to look at 3 issues. We'll take these turn by turn. So one is why long-termism is necessary. 2 is international case studies looking at Wales and elsewhere. And 3, how to overcome the barriers to acting in the long term in the UK context. So starting with why long-termism is needed. So thinking, for example, about how short-termism undermines public policies, the advantages of a long-term approach, and also how this can help us to build a fairer and equal society. Let's start with Kat, please.
Brilliant. And thank you so much. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And it's lovely to see familiar faces on the call as well. Why is long-termism needed? I had 2 thoughts really on that. One is firstly that the report is incredibly important and spot on in terms of its diagnosis, analysis, and recommendations, because it's looking at the problem that has gone from being an important one to now an existential one. And so that is highly aligned with the findings of the liaison committee parliamentary report that came out in 2024 that I was advising on, that basically said that short-termism is now not just a public policy problem, but it's leading to caving legitimacy and trust in government. So that is one reason. I mean, because at the end of the day, if you had had this conversation 20 years ago, the UK would have been better than most of its peer countries in doing this kind of work. But the issue is that it's always been important, but difficult to actually look at the long term. I mean, the government policy profession actually says that that's part of what a civil servant should do, but we have struggled. I mean, if you look at the 1959 Secret Squirrel Macmillan report about the future of the UK, the one that got shut down because it told some uncomfortable truths, or if you look at the 1970 government report, this issue is constantly there, and you can actually see 100 years of how long-termism has been wrestled with in the UK government, with a bad impact on, you know, suboptimal policy outcomes on our security, well-being, and prosperity. And you mentioned a lot of them, but, you know, special educational needs, security, Afghanistan, housing, energy, you can name them. So this is a long-standing issue that we've been wrestling with, but now it's incredibly urgent that we do it now, which is, I think, the second point I wanted to say, which is that what we do know, and I think your 2 solutions point squarely to this, is that a technical solution is not enough. We've had a Government Office of Science since, I think, 2004, looking at strategic foresight. I was part of a Sigma scan in 2006 that spotted 240 issues on the horizon, including digital, et cetera, issues, the gig economy, Brexit even. We've even tried to institutionalize things with things like the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. You had the Wright Report saying many of these things in 2007 by Parliament. So the question is, how do we get beyond this kind of technical approach, which is incremental and able to be kind of then ignored by the challenges of political reality and the here and the now, and move to a whole of government and whole of society approach to really embed, because it then is about making difficult choices around resource allocation. Now, the answer, which is why I think your framing is so interesting and important, is that you need to bring long-termism to life. This needs to be a conversation between politicians and citizens, and nobody ever voted for strategic foresight, public administration, or long-termism. In fact, I spend my time trying to avoid these words because people's eyes roll back into their head. What we need to do is we need to make it human and real. And so it needs to be about acting now in the interests of current and future generations. It needs to be fairness, which is a principle that all of us, including young kids, can understand. And it's, in my international experience, it's an empowering principle that all communities can connect to, whether it's a US local government and citizens who are giving up on the federal level, or the Philippines or Kenya or Cameroon, or Dalit communities in India. And because of the Declaration on Future Generations that was signed last September at the UN, 193 countries have all signed up to this principle. And I think this principle of acting in the interests of current and future generations, holding our politicians to account to it, and mobilizing as citizens about this as an important framework, I think is really, really important to actually have a different kind of conversation about long-termism than the one we had 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
Great, thanks, Kat. Derek, your thoughts, please.
Yes, thank you also for inviting me, and concur with all that Kat has said. I guess the first point to make really is understanding why this is important and making the case for the why. Because I think even now, even in Wales, when we've got this important legislation, people's initial response can be, well, this is impossible to do in short-term political cycles with short-term budget decisions. They don't make it easy, but they don't make it impossible. There are ways in which you can embed a culture and a mindset of long-term thinking, of thinking about future generations within the political environment and context that we have. And I think, Wales has demonstrated that and has 10 years of experience of doing that. My experience of talking and involving the public about this is that people get it. People understand the need to avoid sticking plaster solutions. They understand the need to focus on the long term, to do the right thing for their children and their grandchildren. And when you use that sort of language, you can get broad support, I think, for this long-termism approach in government. And the reasons are clear, but perhaps we should amplify them more often. It can be, if you just look at sort of action on climate change or action on nature, issues that are often at the top of my agenda in delivering for future generations, we know the longer we leave it, the more expensive and more difficult they are to resolve and to turn around. And, the classic example, I guess, is around health. We know a short-termism approach just kicks the can down the road. And in Wales, we have, despite the legislation, we have still some of the highest rates of diabetes and obesity in the country, which will mean our NHS will be unsustainable unless we get ahead of the curve. So the reasons for a long-term approaches are clear. The evidence is clear. I think the arguments can be made very clearly to politicians and to the public as well. And my experience is that the public gets it. I've also, worked across party, and although there might be more skepticism in some parts of the political spectrum than others, in my experience, there is good support cross-party for this approach. People of all parties, they might focus on a different issue, for example, or a particular area of interest over another one, but they broadly support the need to act for the long term.
Fantastic. Thanks, Derek. I'm going to come back straight back to you, Derek, if that's okay, to talk a bit about the Welsh experience. You've obviously just had the 10th anniversary of the Welsh legislation and published a report on that, and we've shared a link to that report in the chat, which I finally managed to make work. It'd be great to hear your thoughts, and please go into detail if you like on what lessons we can learn in the UK from the Welsh legislation and its implementation, and how we can apply those to the UK context.
Yes, thank you. So last week, I published the Future Generations report. So every 5 years under the legislation, 1 year before the Senedd, the Welsh Parliament elections, the Commissioner is required to produce statutory advice to our public sector organisations about my expectations about what they need to deliver, what do they need to do to deliver on the long term. So do look at that report and my assessment of the progress that we've made. Spoiler alert, what it says is you can point to some important changes in Wales, some of which you mentioned, Will, that have happened that can be tracked back to having this legislation in place. There are others as well, big shift in our approach to transport policy and investment in sustainable transport and walking and cycling, recent changes to our education curriculum directly linked to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, similarly ambitious, world-leading approach to waste policy that isn't just leading the world in terms of how we recycle waste, but also applies the integration principle to the waste policy, which I think is really interesting. The integration principle from the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which is not just thinking about waste, but how can it achieve different objectives at the same time? So how can it support social cohesion, tackle loneliness, increase volunteering, whilst also meeting objectives around waste? So these are sort of Wales-wide examples. There are many, many other local and regional examples that have come about because of the legislation, but there's much more that we need to do in order to meet our long-term goals, our well-being goals. Just to talk to the, and I sort of make 50 recommendations about what our public bodies should be doing in order to do that. I guess some lessons from the Welsh model, and I guess it would be good if we get a lot of interest from around the world in the Welsh model. If only we had more interest from across the UK in the Welsh model. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it is 10 years of experience, warts and all, of what's worked and what hasn't. And it's always, I think it's useful learning that can shape the work of local authorities, regional authorities, and UK government too. I think some important points to make about the experience in Wales. One was it was put down on fairly firm foundations. So there was a big involvement process, the Wales We Want conversation, that asked the people of Wales, in their thousands, not the tens of thousands, about the future that they wanted for Wales. Big involvement of the voluntary sector in that process. And that has meant there is a wide sense of stakeholder buy-in for the approach that we've taken. So it's not just me in position to advise public bodies and hold them to account, but it's also local people, local voluntary groups that are also asking their public sector organisations, what are they doing to deliver on the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, on our collective ambition for Wales, and to question and argue if they think decisions being taken are not aligned. I think another point that I would draw on from the Welsh experience is it's about a positive narrative for the future of the country. So the 7 wellbeing goals are our way of delivering on the SDGs, but they're also about agency and working towards something that will inevitably be positive, will inevitably be different. But if we can take the right decisions, can also be positive. So hopefully that gives people a sense of agency in a time of challenge and conflict and difficulty. We're working towards a vision, an ambitious vision that we have for our country, and we're all required to play our bit in delivering that. And then just on that final point, I guess, about all requiring to do this, there are 56 public bodies just in Wales, and a population of 3 million, that fall under the legislation. That's Welsh Government, that is local authorities, health boards, fire services and so forth, national parks. What this does is unite them. They're all got to putting plans in place, demonstrate to me what they will do to deliver on this long-term agenda. And so it encourages, actually enforces collaboration, and recognises that we won't get where we need to do unless we effectively collaborate and share goals rather than continue to work in silos. So there's lots more to share besides that, but those are, I think some key lessons from the Welsh model.
Fantastic, thanks, Derek. And some questions already emerging in the Q&A for you, which we'll come back to shortly. Kat, some reflections. Any reflections on the Welsh experience, but also your thoughts on the broader international context.
Thanks, yes, and happy birthday, Derek. And I think it's really interesting that Derek's point, which is that it's been a scandalous ignoring of what's been happening in Wales by Westminster under the last government. It's really shocking. I was in the room when it was signed in 2015, and there were representatives from the US, from Canada, from the UN, from all across Europe, from Australia, and nobody had bothered making the move from SW1A. So I think that's really interesting because, you know, it's about, you know, and people point to, you know, Wales has got low employment, it's got all sorts of kind of social issues. Why should we be using Wales as a model is the question, right? But the fact is, it's precisely because the kind of current capitalist liberal model market economy that has been in place that we're increasingly running out of steam on hasn't worked, that they've had to be forced to build the political coalition to actually do something radically different. And I think that is the million-dollar insight as well. But Wales really helps us inspire to move from words to action on some of the commitments like Article 28 on the Declaration on Future Generations, which all governments have done to say when we develop policies, we're going to actually develop them, assess them, implement them with a view on how they impact future as well as current generations. And Wales is not alone. There's lots of other innovations that have been happening. And I just want to give you a little bit of a flavour of that. Let me just try and put this on it. Just get this as a little kind of, we can send this around, but it's basically, this is happening globally. You know, the EU you mentioned, there's an intergenerational fairness commissioner and there's a network of ministers for the future. You mentioned New Zealand. There's not only the long-term insights briefing, but some fabulous work done in Maori communities about how you prepare for a very demographically different Maori versus white settler community future, a future of climate change, but also how they invest some of the kind of treaty returns to ensure to support a Maori future. Portugal, the president uses intergenerational fairness assessments to review the policies from the government, an approach that's also been applied and piloted in the UK all-party parliamentary group on future generations a few years ago. So I want to bring out 2 points. One is that this is global and it's a global majority trend, not just global north. And that's really important in a world in which most of the future generations are going to be born in Africa and in Asia. And secondly, you know, I've just come back this month alone, I'm working with a bunch of members of parliament or senators in Kenya, as well as a bunch of members of parliament in Ukraine. Now, this says this issue is salient both in countries where an aid crisis falling off the cliff basically means that members of parliament are having to radically rethink what the future of Kenya looks like in a very new environment, but also in Ukraine when they're confronting a conflict and a war. So I wanted to underline that. So what we've done is distill, I mean, SWAF works with a lot of countries all around the world. And what we've done is distill the insights of how do you actually, what's the recipe for intervening to actually support building futures orientation in the policymaking infrastructure, but also a whole of society approach. And so this handbook has a little bit distilling the recipe for what you can do in your country, heavily influenced by Wales, which is basically, it's not a technical issue. It's absolutely with citizens and with politicians, building that institutional. But I think what I want to kind of really bring out is that you can't do it alone. It's not enough just having a national dialogue or building a strategic foresight unit and doing a report or working with politicians. You need to do that together, which is why the institutional recommendation that you've made around the Future Generations Commissioner is absolutely spot on, because you need that center of gravity, that linchpin to hold the strategy together. And to connect, and the second point is it really needs to connect to the issues and show that it actually makes a difference on issues that are stuck, where there's intergenerational conflict, often, you know, weaponized by some of the less savory parts of society around how we do share the costs in moving to a post-carbon economy. You know, how do we actually, where resources are reduced, think about, you know, lifelong learning versus curriculum reform. How do we think about social care? Now, we need to show that it moves the needle on these issues and can actually bring different solutions by thinking about the long term and intergenerationally and designing these approaches and having politicians as part of that conversation, then it delivers tangibly different results. And I can get onto where I think some of the recommendations that we need to focus on look like in a second.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kat. Derek, over to you for a final question before we move on to the Q&A, audience Q&A side of the webinar, around overcoming some of the specific barriers to long-termism in the UK-wide political context. So in the report, we looked at some of the institutional barriers around the sort of centralisation of government, alongside lack of public engagement, and some of the psychological barriers. But any thoughts on those barriers, or indeed other barriers that we didn't cover in the report for the UK?
There continue to be barriers even with the legislation that we have in Wales, of course. Just to follow on from Kat's comment, one of the best ways of overcoming any of the barriers is about demonstrating impact. So, this can't just be about process or something that seems distant from population or the constituents that our politicians are representing. It's got to show real impact on the ground in terms of the changes that it's making, and that has to be for today and tomorrow. We talked about this earlier on in the seminar. This can sometimes seem to, we're giving up on our issues today or our priorities today in order to sacrifice ourselves for our children and our grandchildren. Well, that's not how we describe it. It's acting today for people today and for tomorrow. But that is the reality as well. It's not just the rhetoric. When I'm working with our public bodies, it's usually about finding the right solutions for the long term that do both. If you don't have that mindset, then you certainly won't find the solutions that do both. But in reality, when we're doing something about climate change or climate adaptation or the nature emergency or health, I'm going to benefit from improved nature, and so are my children, my grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren. Similarly, if we do the right thing by the health system, we'll be a healthier population, but so will we be for generations to come. So it's a reality, not just a bit of rhetoric, that this is acting today for people today, and it's benefiting people tomorrow. So I think concentrating on the why is one part of this, and the impact it's going to have. The other thing that I would say, and it also builds on what Kat was saying, is use the flexibility. There are different ways of skinning this cat, of doing this, and I support your recommendations, particularly around a Future Generations Commission. Of course I would, but actually, we look to other places around the world, and they take different approaches to this. They might not have the same legislation. They might not have a commissioner. They might use a parliamentary committee on futures. They do different things that work in their context, but it's the outcomes that matters. It's what mechanisms and institutions and processes can we put in place to get the outcomes that we seek to achieve. So the Welsh model is not a perfect model. It's just one way of doing this. We've got lessons to share, but increasingly, there are great examples from around the world of other countries and other regions doing similar things that we can draw on. Final point, I would say, I guess there's an energy of doing this at different levels of government. So clearly, this has been possible at the Welsh level. I get contact from local councils in Europe wanting to take this approach. You could see how mayors could take this approach. Actually, it might often be easier to do this at a subnational level and at a local level than it is to do at the UK level, and that sort of builds the momentum for something to happen at UK-wide level. So clearly we want this to happen at the UK-wide level because it's desperately needed, but let's not forget that we can do similar things at a local and a regional level too.
Great, thank you, Derek. Kat, what are your thoughts on how to overcome UK-specific barriers?
I have a wish list. So building on your brilliant recommendations, I would actually add just 2 more to that to kind of connect to, I think, the appetite that I'm seeing in the chat and the questions, which is let's do something substantive that's actually going to move the needle institutionally. And I think a parliamentary committee for the future to support other select committees, which is the legislative is the bipartisan space to hold the long term, and having a bipartisan space that can actually connect to national dialogues around that is, I think, really important. And then also having a principle of intergenerational fairness or solidarity, I think, is really critical to both have the legislative parliament to review legislation that comes to it for fairness, but also incentivize policy makers and civil servants to actually consider that in the design, and also absolutely implement this at the local authority level, which I think is a very, very important idea. You've got Oxford County Council has already started doing this brilliantly. Like there's NHS, one of the NHS North trusts have started reflecting a future generations commissioner. So this is definitely the way forward. But that's just my one recommendation. I had 2 others. One is that I think we need to build a future generations movement in 2025, because we need to build that coalition across the early adopters in government are there already, whether they're the national strategy guys, whether it's the missions guys. There's politicians like Sarah Boyack, some of the people on this call are senior former officials who can really drive this agenda, civil society, including businesses like Ella's Kitchen. This is a moment to take advantage of, and we need to take and connect to the narrative of urgency, because intergenerational solidarity is now a national security asset because of what's happening in Ukraine. The concept of taking for granted how young and old people connect and are together behind an intergenerational social contract that is now critically important in a way that it hasn't been for literally, I think, 70 years. And we also need a how for this missions concept, right? We still haven't got under the skin of what's the practice of doing that. So a future generations coalition and movement can really take advantage of this moment. And secondly, or I think this is a third proposal, is speaking to foundations out there. We need to invest in this, and we need to invest in this in a really big way, because especially for the national dialogue, this can't be held by the executive. It needs to be held by a legitimate coalition of supportive foundations or civil society. And this needs to be done well. It needs to be designed well. It's about power brokering. It's about speaking truth to power. And it's difficult to get the stuff not be co-opted, right? So the psychological safety, the trust, the convening, the weaving coalitions and people who use different language to discuss the same thing, to find common cause, that is not an easy process, but it's an incredibly important one, because what we're doing here is reinventing our state and democracy for the next 80 years. And that's the critical challenge that we have ahead. And I think this is why the Wales example has been so inspiring, because it just gives us, in this massive darkness and turbulence, a kind of shining light of actually what might be possible.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kat. Okay, I'm going to take some audience questions now. I think this is a set of 2 questions I'm going to pose to both of you, I think, and then perhaps some other questions for 1 or 2 of you individually, but do feel free to jump in, of course. So these first 2 questions on the political context, and this is partly around the extent to which the political environment in Wales at least has been an enabling environment, and possibly also what the contrast with the political context in the UK and elsewhere. So yeah, how realistic would it be to put forward a positive view rather than emphasizing the problems of short-termism, as shared stories about wanting our children to be proud of being a part of a country that does X, Y, Z, and we need to do ABC today? Is our politics already too partisan to agree on such a shared story? And linked to that, Derek talking about cross-party consensus on future outcomes, but each party would perhaps differ on the short-term steps that they take towards that future. And so how much of the progress in Wales to date reflects a largely stable political context, and how might things change if or when politics becomes less stable. Derek, do you want to take that first and then Kat?
Yeah, great questions. Well, the recent polling in Wales for the Senedd elections, I'm not sure if everyone would have seen that, but they point to some potentially significant changes in the Welsh Parliament. We already know that the electoral system is changing, the number of Senedd members is increasing, and the polling shows Plaid Cymru, Labour Party and Reform at similar levels. It fluctuates. But over time at similar levels. I think it's difficult to say whether political changes in the past would have disrupted this agenda in Wales. But all I can say is that when I've engaged with political parties, and it's my job to do that, there's generally broad support across political parties. I haven't done that with Reform yet because they're not organised in that sense yet, but we will do. But we will engage with all parties. But the point still stands, I guess, that there's a common sense to this agenda which political parties appreciate and understand and support. And the constituents do too. The need to avoid, as I've talked about, avoid sticking plaster solutions, doing the right thing for our children and grandchildren. I think that language is also important, not just talking in sort of general terms about future generations, but bringing it back home to say, well, this is about your kid and your grandkids or the kid next door and their future in 50 years' time, making it real for people. It is super important in that context. I think some of the controversy in the politics in Wales that I've noticed in my time and my predecessors' time is some of the ways in which this is done, but that can be done in different ways. So not all parties like having independent commissioners, for example. I think it's an important part of why we're making progress and the accountability for government. But it might not be the legislation itself or the approach of focusing on long-termism that becomes politically unpopular. It might just be some of the ways in which that is delivered that some parties have less support for than others. But I guess I go back to the point that we've been making. Wales is a pioneer, but we're no longer an outlier. This is not something that is just of one party. It is something that different parties around the world are looking at because they can see that it can make a result for the people that they represent. And I think holding on to that is key to embedding something that is sustainable through political changes that might come.
Great. Thanks, Derek. Kat, your thoughts on politics?
Yeah. So these are so many very, very interesting questions. Here are some observations. When it comes to members of Parliament and politicians, I think that the Juncker quote is always really salient here, which is, we know what the right thing is to do, we just don't know how to get re-elected when we do it. So there's something about the system at the moment has got incentives to basically encourage people to defect to the present at all times. And that's both from the discount factor that people use in the Green Book and Treasury, all the way through to the fact that, in France is very famous, they say it's 60, 60, 60. Over 60-year-olds own 60% of the assets and actually own 60% of the voting weights. Okay, so there's all sorts of reasons why this means that there's challenges and defections to the present. However, in my experience and having worked with a lot of members of Parliament across all parties, this is actually an agenda that really connects to many of them, and that there is absolutely a majority that would really be interested in taking some of the issues out of political football of the next 5 years and this was actually the terms of the conversation for the liaison committee report. It's just like there are things that are manifestly sensible for the UK to do over the next 20 years, and we are still unable to be able to invest in them or address them. That is a real governance problem. How do we address that, both from a political state effectiveness perspective and also political one? So I am convinced that there is an appetite to do things differently. There is also, I think, and this is to David Oman's point around, is there a kind of central area of agreement amongst citizens? Well, I'm just going to point to the evidence. I think there's three really quite interesting points. First is that, like, young people, all this interesting like statistics around, are young people moving towards dictatorship or not? That is basically a proxy for dissatisfaction with the impact of government and state effectiveness on issues that are going to affect their lives. So yes, you can see a lot of the kind of variability in voting as being a symptom of this issue rather than a reason why we shouldn't be doing and tackling it. The second is that, having done quite a lot of these national dialogues over and over again, and there's brilliant organizations in the UK doing this work, many of them on this call, but Involve, Demos, Ipsos, etc., community level organizations who are bringing people together. There is very often a consolidated center that, if you take people to the future and see what is it, then they may disagree about the short-term means, but that kind of collective delineation is a very, very powerful way of actually bringing people together. And that's, I think, the insight and why strategic foresight as a tool and method really needs to be levered. It's not just about motherhood and apple pie. It's not just about asking people, because people often then tend to return to their Hollywood dystopian images of the future, or they do what they assume, which is that they think that tomorrow is going to look like today, or a extension of a projection of current trajectories. We need to kind of build the future's literacy of communities and young people, including in schools, by the way, as part of this endeavor. But that really, really works. But at the same time, if you look at, Israel, there was a Future Generations Commissioner, but they went too ahead of the political Overton window and then got shut down. So it's really important that this very powerful connection between politicians, Parliament, a Future Generations Commissioner, and citizens is really maintained and held at the heart of this whole discussion.
Fantastic, thanks, Kat. And that also helpfully answers some of the other questions linked to public engagement as well. So a question then for Derek about the Welsh context and selling these kind of policies to a sceptical public. So the question is that the Act is a great bit of legislation for those with a good understanding of sustainability, etc., but it means little in places like Townhill in Swansea. So it's selling it to sceptical voters on the doorstep, basically. How do we sell the Future Generations Act to the lost, angry voters on estates in places like here in Swansea who look likely to dump Labour in favour of reform?
That's such an important question, because this can feel like a top-down agenda. It can seem unrelated to people's lives, and we need to show its relevance and its importance. I started the job thinking that it didn't matter that people in my community, where I come from in Cumbraen, or my parents knew about this legislation, as long as it was making a difference. But I actually think it's critical that we involve people. I believe now that it's critical that we involve people, that they're aware of what this is about, and they're enabled to take action and to challenge public sector organisations to deliver, because that's how we make the real difference that we need to see if everyone is engaged. I love this legislation to feel much more like people's legislation, that very much they're brought about by a national conversation, and people championing it up and down Wales to see it delivered. One of the key themes of my report, the Future Generations report, is exactly this point, in that we are seeing growing distrust in our politicians, in our public bodies. Misinformation is perhaps the biggest challenge that we face in delivering on some of these important issues and resolving them. So we can't ignore that. We have to double down on finding ways in which to hear people, understand where they're at, listen to their concerns and act on their concerns, whilst implementing the important steps that we need to take for the long term. I'm not saying that's easy to do, but it's absolutely critical that we do that, because we won't achieve it if citizens are not on board. There is a popular narrative, there is a positive narrative as well around all of this stuff, which we're not doing a good enough job of talking about. The benefits of decarbonisation to stable heating bills, or to how we do something about flooding, or how we can improve people's health and improve the health service by focusing on prevention. There's a positive narrative around this that we need to talk to people about, but we also need to demonstrate them impact, show clear examples of where it's making a difference, and also work with them to find the solution. So, for example, one of the big issues of challenge in Wales at the moment is pylons and the pylon infrastructure that we need to implement. Quite clearly, many people don't want pylons on their doorstep in beautiful rural parts of Wales. So how can we do this in a way that either, where possible, we seek to underground things, or where that's not possible, we talk to people and explain that wouldn't be possible, but we might be able to do something about your heating bills because of your energy bills, sorry, as a result of, the inconvenience of having this on your doorstep. So those conversations in communities with people have to be at the heart of this agenda. The involvement principle is one of the 5 ways of working which public bodies are required to implement as part of this process, and it's critically important that they do so. We're seeing some good examples of where that's happening in Wales, but it's not happening systematically enough. So, there's new technology, there are different techniques of how we engage people that we need to make better use of, to make sure we take people with us on this journey, we listen to their concerns, and we act on what matters to them. Otherwise, we won't make the progress that we need to make.
Great. Thank you, Derek. Kat, a couple of specific policy recommendations that I'd be grateful for your quick thoughts on, and you've got about 4 minutes, so 2 minutes per recommendation, or feel free to adjust either way. The first is around the idea of incentivizing politicians to choose future-proof actions or systemic change over immediate reward, for example, through 10-year peerages or other parliamentary awards or incentive mechanisms. So the example of we could have kept Nick Clegg in public life in the UK in 2015 after he did the right thing for the country, but not his party in 2010, is the example given in the question. And the second is, could we start to design a Citizens' Bill of Rights for the UK to encourage long-term thinking on how to deliver those ideals?
So one was the Mo Ibrahim style approach to incentivizing policy change. I think that the answer is in the question, in that I don't think that that's enough to drive the kind of systemic level of change that we need. It's definitely helpful, but it needs to be absolutely part of another much broader conversation. I mean, I think actually connecting it to budget allocations, if there's one thing that I would do is get into the Treasury, look at how, spending reviews, Del Amy percentage discounts, I think are really important. Bill of Rights, interesting. I think, back to the connecting with the previous point, citizens, if this is not embedded at the citizen level, if this doesn't fundamentally change how citizens see their government delivering on the needs and challenges that are facing them, then there's no point in doing this, and we might as well go home, right? If this is a kind of interesting intellectual think tanky policy wonky conversation, this is really failed because we have tried incremental long-term thinking, futures stuff before. And the reason this stuff can be transformative and why we need it at the moment, given the fact that current political models are failing to deliver on a safe, prosperous, ecologically resilient future, is because we're not connecting to the innovations and the energy and the insights that come from citizens. And that needs to be at the center of all our work. So we do futures work, and we know that the engine of transformation always comes from the periphery. You're not going to get a transformed view of what democracy looks like in the UK from a bunch of people sitting around the CEO table or Number 10, or even us, quite frankly. So how do we distribute and what the infrastructure, how do we build, in particular, next generation young people to hold these intergenerational conversations and then connect it to the topics that really make a difference? So the other reason why Bill of Rights is like, it's interesting, but what we need to do is actually make a difference on housing. We need to make a difference on curriculum. So people feel as if they're going to leave higher or secondary school with something that's useful for their jobs, etc., etc., etc. So that is probably what I'd like to kind of focus on. And therefore, and just, you know, Derek gave the happy, you know, the positive scenario. I really think that this is, you know, we are going to lose under 30-year-olds very, very quickly if we do not move very meaningfully on this agenda. Our political landscape in the next 5 to 7 years is going to be radically transformed should we not decide to grip and really think about what intergenerational exchange looks like at the heart of our governance processes.
Thanks, Kat. I think that challenge is a good note to end on. So with that, I'd like to thank our panelists, Kat Tully and Derek Walker. Thank you to my colleague Anita Sanger for writing our report, Mission to the Future, and thank you all for coming and for your questions. Our next online event on Tuesday, the 13th of May, next Tuesday at 5 p.m, looks at how political thinkers throughout history have thought about the harms and risks of inequality, the greatest of all plagues, and see fairnessfoundation.com/events for more information and to sign up. Thank you. Goodbye.